A nigga like me, man, I love the game. I love the hustle, man. I be feeling like one of them ball-playing niggas, you know? Like Bird, or Magic, or something. Yeah, you know, a nigga got dough. A nigga could leave the league. But if I leave, the fans still gonna love me, man? I get love out here in Harlem, man. I done sold coke on these streets, man. Hash, weed, heroin. As long as niggas is feeling it, a nigga like me can hustle it. That's my gift in life, eh? You know? What? The fuck you laughing at, B?
You, man. Funny, man. You a hustling motherfucker, man. For real, baby. You fucking killing me, man.
Well, you know me, baby.
In this video, I'm going to, I wouldn't even say attempt, I'm going to systematically deconstruct I wouldn't call it white supremacists, white nationalists, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to systematically break down why this myth that Africa is where it is because of just a lack of intelligence. First, I'm going to play the interview with Tommy Sotomayor, who interviewed Jared Taylor. And it was a very great and productive interview because we actually got to see into the mind of the white nationalist that is Jared Taylor, and pretty much his whole argument, all of the arguments that a lot of these guys from David Duke, Richard Spencer, all these different guys, they make a lot of arguments and they really unfairly impugn a lot of, I guess, what's the word? Ignorance, incompetence on Africa. And they tend to make Africa seem as though it is just where it is today simply because they're ignorant. I know a lot of African subscribers that I have. I think one of them's Hannah 6000. They think I don't have a problem with Africans. I really don't. Let me just say that I don't. I have a problem with Africans who come to America and disrespect African Americans. I've made a few videos where I went in on that subject. When I say disrespect, I mean they come to America and they go out of their way to identify with whites. They go out of their way to separate themselves from us. But if an African comes to America and identifies as not just African American in the sense of, hey, I'm from Africa and hyphenate, but they identify with being black, I have no problem with them. I have no problem whatsoever. You can be from Africa if you understand the struggle and you take the time to understand the struggle. You take the time to speak with, the descendants of slaves and understand who we are and where we're coming from. And, you filter out all the fluff, because there's a lot of fluff in the black community. I will admit that. And Africans have a serious point in a lot of the things that they point out about how African Americans don't take advantage of opportunity. But right now we need, it's like brothers and sisters fighting each other, and somebody's coming from around the corner. They're not in the family and they're coming in and saying something. So in this video, I'm going to go into the whole argument about Black intelligence. I'm going to point out the poorest nations in the world. I'm going to point out the wealthiest nations in the world. I'm going to point out the productivity of people when they come to America from these low IQ, quote unquote, nations. I'm going to show their average income. Some of these people, I'm going to even break down the whole income, immigrant lottery that we have in America. Some of these people come from nations like Nigeria, India, and they have excuses for that. They say, okay, well, the Igbos are, for example, are a high IQ group of Africans, so they come to America and they do well. Or they'll say something like the Indians, the reason they have the highest salary is because a lot of them come, those are the best and brightest Indians that come. So I'm going to get into that. This is going to be a fun video. I'm excited about doing it. At this moment, it's still on the cutting block. But by the time you hear this, it'll already be finished. I really want to address this issue. O'Shea, shout out to the homie. He said, why do we get into these arguments with these people? This isn't even an argument. This is more so research as well as empowerment for brothers and sisters who may get into a conversation with someone or may not get into a conversation or debate or whatever. They may want to believe some of the propaganda that, okay, the closer you are to the equator, the more ignorant you are, So I'm going to systematically break that down in this video. First, I'm going to start with Tommy and his interview of Jared Taylor, and then I'm going to go from there. So let's get to it.
Now, when you were talking, and I want to get to this part where you talked about IQ, when you were talking to the guy, you guys got into a discussion about IQ, which is strange because before he spoke to you, he had done another radio show stating that he felt whites were more intelligent than blacks. So I didn't understand why he would have been offended by that comment. You were explaining reasons why you believe blacks, and I guess specifically in the United States, because if you see the Nigerians who come over here, they do well, and you spoke about that. But the blacks specifically in the United States, yes. If you had to put together some things that would lead to the lower IQ of the blacks in the United States than the other groups, i.e. the Asians, because I talk about that a lot. I said blacks will claim like the SAT is culturally biased, which is strange because I went to high school with a young girl who her first coming to the United States, she was in the 8th grade. She made the highest SAT score in the state that year. So if it's culturally biased and we've been here 400 years, what other culture do we know? And yet this person who was raised somewhere else came here. So what do you think is the or some of the reasons why IQ is so different amongst American blacks and every other group?
Well, it is something of a false distinction to say that Nigerians, for example, those who do come well, they come here, they do well, but it is a highly selected sample of Nigerians. The evidence is that perhaps except for the Igbo or the Igbo, who are recognized throughout West Africa as a very, very high IQ tribe, aside from them, if you got an average sample of Nigerians coming to the United States, they wouldn't do so well. But the ones who do come are very smart. If you are a Nigerian and you are able to immigrate legally to the United States, if it's not just through that diversity visa lottery, you've got a lot on the ball. You've probably got a college education. You're at least middle class, maybe upper class. It's not the average Nigerian who's coming. But in the case of Africans as a rule, and it's not just Africans, the closer you get to the equator, whether it is in the southern and South America or in Africa, the lower the IQ tends to be. And the most rational and I think convincing explanation for this is that the warmer the environment, the less pressure there is environmentally on forward thinking, planning for the winter, cooperating. If you were living in Europe or in East Asia, and you have got to prepare for the winter. If you don't store seed for the next crop, or if you don't go out and you kill enough game and you preserve it in some way, you're going to die. You have to think ahead. There are real environmental pressures that are going to sift the population, and the dumb ones aren't going to survive. It's the same also, one of the other things they say is that if you are living in an environment in which you live on big game, big game is a cooperative undertaking. You have to get, at least a dozen men to cooperate if they're going to go kill a mastodon. And then once the mastodon is dead, you have got to separate, you've got to share the meat appropriately. All of this places a greater demand on a population living in a place like that compared to a group where it's summer all year round and there are fruit-bearing trees, plants are always growing year round. The demands, the on the environment that force towards intelligence are just not as severe. Now, that to me is the most convincing explanation as to why East Asians have such a high IQ and the people who live close to the equator. It's not just blacks, Australian Aborigines. According to the best culture-free testing we can come up with, the average IQ of Aborigines is 65, 70. That's an astonishingly low figure. But then when you look at the cultural achievements of Aborigines before white people showed up, it's pretty doggone minimal. And their tested IQ today is not inconsistent with the way they were living before other people showed up.
It's funny. I've never spoken to you, but I've said this for years. I've said white people lived in harsher environments. In order to survive in those harsher environments, they had to, like you said, plan things out. But when you wake up every day and there's sunshine and there's fruit and you have not much need to think about, navigating the land like that or building something to harvest the crops because it's just there, or having a way to preserve it. And I also said, because in a lot of these countries, there's a high amount of natural resources. Yet when you go to these other places where whites were, well, they weren't. So when whites would come to these places, they would see people having an abundance of something that they didn't have. So it kind of gave them more of the aggressive nature too, to want to take it. Do you see that as well?
Yes, I think that's certainly the case. And when the first white explorers came to Sub-Saharan Africa, they didn't find any written language. They didn't find mechanical devices. They didn't find the wheel. They didn't find a calendar. And it was, I think it was wrong on their part to think, okay, not only are we going to take their resources, but we're going to teach them our religion and we're going to teach them our way of life. Well, first of all, I do think that colonization was not an exclusively ruthless exploitation the way it is taught today. Perhaps the Belgian Congo, when it was the personal possession of King Leopold, he pretty much treated it as an orange for him to squeeze dry personally. But aside from that rather discreditable experience, colonization really did have a kind of uplift element to it. And I will tell you an interesting story. When I was traveling in West Africa, I spent months just sort of hitchhiking and vagabonding and bumming around in a number of West African countries. And I had been in the Ivory Coast, which at that time was doing very well. And it was also one of the prized possessions in the former French Empire. And there were a lot of French people who were there as what they called cooperants. And some of them worked side by side with people in the government. Others were in private or nonprofit enterprises, sort of making sure that Ivory Coast did well. And Ivory Coast was called the Japan of West Africa. Its economy was really booming. The streets were well paved. People dressed sharp. And it was a pretty impressive place. Well, I went across the border into Liberia. And as soon as I crossed the border, I was shocked. The place looked like it was bombed out. Huge potholes. Everything's tumbled down. People dressed in rags. The automobiles. You wonder how this thing is even going to run. They looked so beat up. And as I always did when I went to a new country, I went to the capital and I went to the university because I was pretty young at the time. This is 1970. I was 19 years old. And I would hang out with the young people. And when you go to university, you get these sort of sharp guys who've got a view on things. And I went up, I asked a Liberian, a fellow, he let me stay in his dorm room. I'd kind of beg a place to stay, and so this, in any case, I was a bum, and I tried to make myself charming, and it worked, and that's a good way to get to know people,
Yeah.
If you stay in some Hilton hotel, you're not going to get to know anybody. So I was a bum, and I would hitchhike, and I'd stay with people. I asked this guy, look, I don't mean to be rude, but I just came from Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast is really ticking along like a watch. Your country, and I hate to say it, is just a mess by comparison. Why? He says, what a stupid question. We did not have the benefit of being colonized by white people.
Wow.
At that time, At that time, I was a good little liberal. And I thought this colonization, this horrible thing, all these exploitative, rapacious white people squeezing the life out of these noble black folks, who would have invented nuclear reactors and jet airplanes, I suppose, if white people hadn't showed up. I didn't take it that far. In any case, to me, that was a real eye-opener. I thought, what the heck? But that was his very simple explanation of why Ivory Coast was doing so much better than Liberia. And there is, I think, a very profound truth there. And the fact is, I later went back to Africa, and there is a not inconsiderate number of Africans who would say that we were better off under the British. Things worked better. Government was more fair. There are people even in South Africa, nobody in an official position, who would say we were better off when the Boers were running the country. You are much better off with a white guy being your boss than a black guy being your boss. Not everybody will take this view, but it is not a tiny, tiny minority that takes that view.
Okay, now you just saw that. He just basically said that first he mentioned the lottery. See, he was very slick in his wording. He said that the people that are part that from coming, a lot of people come from these from the Igbo tribe and things of that nature. I'll tell you what, let me first explain what the lottery is, or let me give you a clip breaking down how that works, so we can really get an understanding, because he just brushed over the lottery as if, he's basically saying people that come over here from the lottery are not productive. And so I'm going to get into that, and then we're going to go into some more facts about Africa and why it's been destabilized.
Visa lottery
so let's
program
get to it.
Basically works like this. The world is divvied up into 6 regions. We have Africa, we have North America, Latin America, Asia, Europe, and Oceania, which I think is just Australia. But basically, we're going to take 50,000 people from these different areas from the countries there. And it's determined by your country of birth, not where you're living, not your nationality, but your country of birth. And the way that it works is we look at the previous 5 years of immigration, and we use those statistics to determine basically which different areas have the most people coming here. And then that 50,000 is kind of divvied up proportionally to give the other areas a better chance. Now, these are huge amounts of people that are trying to come to the United States. In 2015, there were 15 million people that filled out this electronic form. It's free, anybody can fill it out, and then you are in the lottery. And there's also a rule that if your country in the last 5 years has had 50,000 people through the ordinary means of getting visa, then you're exempt from this lottery. And currently, there's a number of countries that are exempt from the 2019 lottery, and those countries are Bangladesh, Brazil, Canada, China, Colombia, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Haiti, India, Jamaica, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, Peru, the Philippines, South Korea, the UK, except Northern Ireland, which is treated a little bit differently, and Vietnam.
Okay, the Africans from many nations they aren't from Nigeria. So there's a problem. I had the Philippines on there. They're 4th on the highest income earning list in the country. The Philippines, America has, I think they have a Marine base over there. So a lot of them may actually creep through the cracks. So let's disqualify Nigeria, let's disqualify Jamaica, and let's disqualify India. We still have an issue. First we have Indonesia. Indonesia has an average IQ of 87. Indonesian Americans have an average salary or income of $61,000. I'm going to skip Jamaicans. People from Trinidad have an IQ the exact same as African Americans at 85. Average salary, $55,000. People from Laos have an average IQ of 89, which is only 4 points higher. Average IQ of 53,000. Now take in mind that African Americans' average salary is $40,000. And why am I going into income? Because income, as I said in the other video, is pretty much a great report card of your productivity. You see, the more productive you are for a company, the more they're willing to pay you. So the more you can produce, the more your human capital that you possess rewards you. So let me keep going down the list. Let's see. People from Thailand have a lower IQ than African Americans at 84, yet they have an average income of 53,000. People from Ghana have an average IQ literally 12 points lower than the average African American, yet they have an average salary of $59,000, higher than Indonesians, who have an IQ literally 15 points higher than theirs, 14 points higher than theirs. People from Turkey who have an IQ only 5 points higher than ours, average salary 61,000. People from Lebanon, IQ of 82, 3 points lower than ours, average salary $74,000. Sri Lanka have an IQ 6 points lower than ours, average salary $73,000. Iranians, 84 average IQ, highest, they make $72,000. People from Egypt, 81 IQ, average income of $61,000. What I'll do is I'll put the links in the description to these pages so you can see specifically which companies make the most, which companies pay the most. Which groups of people make the most money. That way we can see who makes what, who's the most productive. Because we've been fed this narrative that African Americans are where they are and Africans are where they are just on IQ. Let's not forget what Stefan Molyneux said, that African Americans are where they are just because of their IQ, the black IQ issue. So shout out to the homie Black Patriarch. He actually did an excellent video on this subject. So go to his channel and check it out. You have to read it. So be sure you can sit and actually read because he doesn't really speak on his videos. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the history of Africa as it pertains to their independence. We're familiar, if you're not, was the first African nation that won its independence. There's a guy, first president, Kwame Nkrumah was his name. Kwame Nkrumah was the first independent nation of Africa. I think, if I'm not mistaken, research, but I think he spent some time in America around Marcus Garvey. I think he dealt with Marcus Garvey. I think he wrote for his newspaper. I'm not sure. I have to do some research on that. But I think he went to Lincoln University in the United States, and he actually got that Pan-African worldview of his, where he looked at African nations as a whole and not just alone tribes, from dealing with Marcus Garvey. That is why their flag, a lot of these countries' flags have red, black, and green in them. When they first got their independence, they were on that Pan-African mindset. What's his face? What's his name? Dr. John Henry Clark taught over there in Ghana at a university in Ghana. So we had a lot of ties. We don't have as many as we did back then. Well, actually, we're developing them now, but there was a break from us as Americans from Africans. That's something that has been expressly written as a government policy by the United States, CIA, FBI. This is something that they've always talked about. So I'm gonna give you this speech with Kwame Nkrumah, basically outlining why Africa had to struggle. And this was in the early 60s when he gave this speech. It was in the 60s, late 50s, early 60s, around that time when he was saying this. They were gaining their independence, and just listen to what he says about what they were fighting against and what they were up against.
The forces arrayed against us are, and I use the word most carefully, formidable. They are entrenched and powerful. They are, as I've taken some pains to explain, they operate in worldwide combinations at all levels: political, economic, military, cultural, educational, social, and trade. And not all, and through intelligence, cultural, and information services. They operate from European and African centers, using agents who, I'm ashamed to say, are often unpatriotic sons of Africa, buying personal satisfactions with the betrayal of their country's safety and integrity. They seduce leaders. They seduce leaders of the African political, trade union, and people's organization, thus creating rifts and quarrels within the national front. On the broader front, they are massing their forces in a determined effort to stay the advance of African liberation and the march of unity. They are attempting many methods, some sinister, some beguiling, to wreck our efforts. They strike antipathetic postures. On one side, they perform acts calculated to strike fear. On the other, they try to hoodwink us with fictitious gifts, which superficially pander to our hopes and aspirations. They are the president's attempts to deflect our purpose, to weaken our determination.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed.
Okay, so you saw that, right? Now that was a good point. That pretty much spells out the gist of this video as to it, as it pertains to why Africa is where it is and it, is like it is. But I'm gonna bring the point home. Let's look at Patrice Lumumba. Now I'm gonna give you an interview from a few people who pretty much co-sign and admit the whole thing. This is public knowledge now. This is declassified documents pretty much explain that the United States killed Patrice Lumumba because he took a stance that was against their interests and in the interest of the native African-born Africans, right? And what the government do with their policies, like as Kwame Nkrumah just pointed out, was just that they would hire black people in Africa to execute their plans and what they like so that they can extract wealth. You see, every cell phone in this country is pretty much they use something that comes, I forget the name of it, but there's a particular element with the cell phone that you have in your hand if you're listening, or even your laptop. You can't get the electronics that you have without these elements coming up out of Africa. The whole gist of Nokia cell phones and all the technology that a lot of these European nations have provided comes from minerals that are in Africa. So just think about that for a second. So also, Patrice Lumumba, if you don't know, was the first democratically elected president of the Congo. He was assassinated, destabilized by people within the African nation. Let me let Malcolm X give you a brief synopsis and also have this other video where they talk about it.
Congolese have been massacred by white people in the Congo for years and years and years. And if the shoe is now on the other foot, only thing I can say is it's like chickens that always come back home to roost.
Do you personally feel, though, that there's some shame or involvement here or some guilt associated with the killing of other human beings?
I think that the white people should be ashamed of the deplorable situation that has been existing in the Congo, which is not the fault of the Congolese, but which is the result of instigation by European powers who are fighting each other over the mineral wealth of the Congo. And now to make it appear that the Congolese themselves are criminals or brutes because they're reacting to these injustices that they've been victimized by is again ducking the question.
Shambi is the murderer of Lumumba, who was the rightful prime minister of the Congo. Shambi is the man whose forces fought against the United Nations forces and against the United States, and despite this criminal past of Shambi, now the United States is backing Shambi, who has hired South African mercenaries who are hired killers to disrupt the peaceful efforts of the freedom fighters from Stanleyville to make the type of country there that they want. And it is this American support of Shambi, actually, that's at the root of the whole problem.
Well, it's been nearly 2 months since Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi was killed. The video of him being brutalized by rebels in his own stronghold have made the rounds on the internet and sparked debate. Now, Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin says the U.S. had direct involvement in the death of Gaddafi.
Who did this? Drones, including those of the U.S., struck his motorcade, and then commandos who were not supposed to be there called for the so-called opposition and militants by the radio, and he was killed without an investigation or trial.
Well, joining me now to talk about this, investigative journalist Wayne Madsen, who returned from Libya not too long ago. Welcome, Wayne. So first I want to ask you your reaction to Prime Minister Vladimir Putin's statement that the U.S. was directly involved in Gaddafi's death.
Well, I think the Prime Minister Putin is correct because, of course, as Prime Minister, he has access to his own intelligence that was gathered from every place, from Russian diplomats to intelligence operatives and other sources. I myself received a call the morning that Gaddafi was captured along with his son and other members of his entourage. They left Sirte after sun up. Now, the charge was they were trying to escape. If they were trying to escape Sirte, they would have left while it was still dark, under cover darkness, with headlights off, and instead they waited for sun up. At that point, when the sun came up, about 8 o'clock in the morning, at full sunrise, over Sirte, all these white flags started to appear. White flags of truce, white flags of surrender. It was quite clear that something had been worked out in advance where Gaddafi was either going to go to another location to either surrender, or a deal was worked out where he could leave for another country. We now know that there was negotiations in March of this year between Gaddafi's government and an American private security firm called Executive Action that was negotiating a deal where Gaddafi might be able to go to either Zimbabwe or South Africa. But it looks like the U.S. and the NATO, the drones that had him under surveillance, and the people, the Libyan rebels who were there with U.S. Special Forces present, violated the white truce, white flag of truce, white flag of surrender, something that's been very rarely done. The U.S. did it to the Indians during our genocide of the Native Americans. But the white flag of truce surrender has been recognized since the year 25, the Eastern Han Chinese dynasty. That is an egregious violation of the laws of war, and I think Putin is correct when he said the U.S. was directly involved in Gaddafi's brutal death, and showing scenes of the body of him and his son for days and days and days is just indicative of U.S. policy. We did it with Saddam's sons. They were being shown in a morgue, and when our forces took out Jonas Savimbi in Angola, the rebel leader, he was seen laying on a slab with about 16 bullet holes in his body. The U.S. seems to have a macabre culture of death, and you have to ask, some of the people at the CIA and Pentagon, do they bathe in human blood on a daily basis? This is just a macabre type situation with some of our leadership.
I do want to ask you, because you were recently in Libya, you were in the middle of it all, what you saw for yourself and what you heard from your sources. The Pentagon has acknowledged that drones were involved in Libya, but they are denying that there were boots on the ground. To your knowledge, what is the truth behind that?
Well, when I was in Libya, we were seeing a fresh videotape coming in from the field, from the battlefront, showing Libyan rebels uncrating brand new FN assault rifles. That's a Belgian company. These were chambered for NATO rounds. Coming out of the crates, you could clearly see these were new weapons. Where are they coming from? Obviously, NATO was in there arming these rebels. These rebels, we were told, oh, they're using old Soviet weapons from the time of during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union sold Libya a lot of weapons. We saw very few. We saw evidence of very little use of Soviet-made weaponry. This was all brand new NATO weapons being used by the rebels.
I want to ask you to reflect also on another thing Putin said there. He argues that his death went down without an investigation, without a trial. Do you think Gaddafi's death was justice served in this case?
Oh, absolutely not. You know, whether he had gone off to South Africa or Zimbabwe and he got a chance to, you know, write an article or give an interview, or even if he was in before the tribunal in The Hague, where he had a chance to give his side of the story, I think a lot of Western powers would have been very embarrassed by what Colonel Gaddafi would have had to say about his past relationship with the CIA, for example, which helped engineer his coup in 1969 to overthrow the senile old king, King Idris. Now Idris's family thinks they have some right to take over Libya again as in some sort of a renewed monarchy. But clearly, people like Gaddafi and Tariq Aziz, a former Iraqi deputy prime minister under Saddam Hussein, who's now, the Iraqi government says they're going to execute him. People like Manuel Noriega, who's you know, pushing 80, he's in a prison in Panama. These people who have done these deals with the United States know too much, and you see what happens to them. They're either killed or they're put in prison and they throw the key away.
And after the death of Gaddafi, the brutal death of Gaddafi, images of it were all over television screens, all over the internet. Having been there and witnessed what it's like there firsthand, what was your reaction to seeing these images?
Oh, it was appalling. I was actually in Tripoli for the 40th anniversary of the Libyan Revolution in 2009. I was in Gaddafi's tent in the compound, which came under incessant bombing during the NATO bombing campaign. I mean, Gaddafi was well respected in Africa. He had a lot of plans which may have come up right against some plans by the British, French, and U.S. for Africa. He wanted to create an African currency unit and stop trading with, you know, based on the dollar and the euro. He was a great promoter of development in some African countries. He invited a lot of guest workers from Africa into Libya to work, from the poorest countries, Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea. They could all come to Libya, make a decent wage, and unfortunately the rebels, who are largely Berbers, who are racist, you know, many of them are racist, targeted these African workers as so-called mercenaries, and this was put out by the corporate media here, that Gaddafi went and hired a bunch of mercenaries. He did not. These were guest workers who were laid upon by the rebels. They were brutally killed. Their wives and daughters were raped. And this is the legacy of the so-called Libyan rebels. When the history books are written without the interference of the propagandists, this is what the story is going to tell.
And this story, we're not hearing a lot about it in the mainstream media. Do you think it's important to keep this story alive and for these kinds of details to come out?
Yeah, well, I think it is, because what we see is the United States engaged and its allies engaged in these blood sports. They foment these rebellions in these countries, and then they have these external forces come in. In Libya, it was the Salafists, many of them backed by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, the most extreme Islamic people you can find. This is the legacy. The same blueprint is now being used in Syria, and as we know from Senator McCain's comments, they have plans to maybe use these in Russia. He was quite open about the fact that he hopes that Prime Minister Putin goes the way of Gaddafi. Incredible coming from a U.S. senator.
Wayne, thank you so much for giving your insight on all of this. That was Wayne Madison, investigative journalist.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
This week marks the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. He was the first democratically elected leader of what is now known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Congo had been a colony of Belgium since the late 1800s, which ruled it over it with brutality while plundering its rich natural resources. Patrice Lumumba rose as a leader of the Congo's independence movement and in 1960 was elected as the first prime minister of the country.
Lumumba's Pan-Africanism and his vision of a united Congo gained him many enemies. Both Belgium and the United States actively sought to have Lumumba overthrown or killed. The CIA ordered his assassination but could not complete the job. Instead, the United States and Belgium covertly funneled cash and aid to rival politicians who seized power and arrested President Lumumba. This is how it was reported in a Universal Studios newsreel in December of 1960.
A new chapter begins in the dark and tragic history of the Congo with the return to Leopoldville of deposed Premier Lumumba, following his capture by crack commandos of strongman Colonel Mobutu. Taken to Mobutu's headquarters, past a jeering, threatening crowd, Lumumba, but promised the pro-red Lumumba a fair trial on charges of inciting the army to rebellion. Lumumba was removed to an army prison outside the capital as his supporters in Stanleyville seized control of Oriental province and threatened a return of disorder. Before that, Lumumba suffered more indignities, including being forced to eat a speech, which he restated his claim to be the Congo's rightful premier. Even in bonds, Lumumba remains a dangerous prisoner, storm center of savage loyalties and equally savage opposition.
On January 17, 1961, after being beaten and tortured, the Congolese Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, was shot and killed. For more, we go to Adam Hochschild. He's the author of King Leopold's Ghost, a story of greed, terror, and heroism in colonial Africa, and the forthcoming book, To End All Wars, a story of loyalty and rebellion. He teaches at the Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, is co-founder of Mother Jones Magazine, had an op-ed in the New York Times this week called All Assassination and Assassination's Long Shadow. Adam Hochschild is joining us from San Francisco. Explain this long shadow, Adam.
Well, Amy, I think the assassination of Lumumba was something that was felt by many people to be a sort of pivotal turning point in the saga of Africa gaining its independence. In the 1950s, there were movements for independence all over Africa. There was a great deal of idealism in the air. There was a great deal of hope in the air, both among Africans and among their supporters in the United States and Europe, that at last these colonies would become independent. And I think people imagined real independence, that is, that these countries would be able to set off on their own and control their own destiny economically as well as politically. And the assassination of Lumumba really signaled that that was not to be. Because for Belgium, as for the other major European colonial powers like Britain and France, giving independence to an African colony was okay for them as long as it didn't disturb existing business arrangements, as long as the European country could continue to own the mines, the factories, the plantations. Well, okay, let them have their politics. But Lumumba spoke very loudly, very dramatically, saying Africa needs to be economically independent as well. And it was a fiery speech on this subject that he gave at the actual independence ceremonies, June 30th, 1960, where he was replying to an extremely arrogant speech by King Baudouin of Belgium. It was a speech he gave on this subject that I think really began the process that ended 2 months later with the CIA, with White House approval, decreeing that he should be assassinated.
And, of course, for most Americans who were not perhaps as familiar with African colonialism, since that was basically a European project throughout the 19th century, the role of Belgium and the importance of the Congo as really the jewel of Africa in terms of its wealth and resources. How did the Congo suffer before Lumumba came to power?
Well, the story really begins in the modern era in 1885, or 1884 to 85, when all the major countries of Europe, preceded by the United States, actually, we were the very first, recognized the Congo not as a Belgian colony, but as the private, personally owned colony of King Leopold II of Belgium. A very greedy, ambitious man who wanted a colony of his own. At that point, Belgium was not sure that it wanted a colony. Leopold ruled this place for 23 years, made an enormous fortune, estimated at over $1 billion in today's American dollars. Finally, in 1908, he was forced to give it up to become a Belgian colony, and then he died the following year. And the Belgians ran it for the next half century, extracting an enormous amount of wealth, initially in ivory and rubber, then in diamonds, gold, copper, timber, palm oil, all sorts of other minerals. And as with almost all the European colonies in Africa, this wealth flowed back to Europe. It benefited the Europeans much more than the Africans. And the hope that many people had when independence came all over Africa, for the most part, within a few years on either side of 1960, people had the hope that at last African countries would begin to control their own destiny, and they would be the ones who would reap the profits from the mines and the plantations and so on. Lumumba put that hope into words, and for that reason he was immediately considered a very dangerous figure by the United States and Belgium. The CIA issued this assassination order with White House approval, and as was said at the beginning, they couldn't get close enough to him to actually poison him, but they got money under the table to Congolese politicians who did see that he was assassinated. With Belgian help, it was a Belgian pilot who flew the plane to where he was killed, a Belgian officer who commanded the firing squad. And then the really disastrous thing that followed was this enthusiastic United States backing for the dictatorial regime of Mobutu, who seized total power a couple of years later and ran a 32-year dictatorship, enriched himself by about $4 billion, and really ran his country into the ground, was greeted by every American president, with the sole exception of Jimmy Carter, who was in office during those 32 years. And he left the country a wreck from which it has still not recovered.
Adam Hochschild, I want to play a clip of the former CIA agent John Stockwell talking about the CIA's plans to assassinate the Prime Minister of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba.
The CIA had developed a program to assassinate Lumumba under Devlin's encouragement and management. The program they developed, the operation didn't work. They didn't follow through on it. It was to give poison to Lumumba, and they couldn't find a setting in which to get the poison to him successfully in a way that it wouldn't appear to be a CIA operation. I mean, you couldn't invite him to a cocktail party and give him a drink and have him die a short time later, obviously. And so they gave up on it. They got cold feet. And instead, they handled it by the chief of station talking to Mobutu about the threat that Lumumba posed, and Mobutu going out and killing Lumumba, having his men kill Lumumba.
What about the CIA's relationship with Mobutu? Were they paying him money?
Yes, indeed. I was there in 1968 when the chief of station told the story about having been, the day before, that day, having gone to make a payment to Mobutu of cash, $25,000, and Mobutu saying, "Keep the money. I don't need it." And by then, of course, Mobutu's European bank account was so huge that $25,000 was nothing to him.
That was former CIA agent John Stockwell talking about the CIA's plans to assassinate Lumumba. Juan?
Well, Adam, I'd like to ask you, you were in the Congo shortly after Lumumba's death. Could you talk about, we have about a minute, could you talk about your personal experiences there and what you saw?
Yes, I was there. I was just a college student at the time. And I wish I could say that I was smart and politically knowledgeable enough to realize the full significance of everything I was seeing. I was not, and it was really only in later years that I began to understand it. But what I do remember, and this was, as I say, 6 months or so after he was killed, was the sort of ominous atmosphere in Leopoldville, as the capital was called then. These jeeps full of soldiers who were patrolling the streets, the way the streets quickly emptied at dusk. And then two very, very arrogant guys at the American Embassy who were proudly talking over drinks one evening about how this person, Lumumba, had been killed, whom they regarded, not as a democratically elected African leader, but as an enemy of the United States. And so, of course, I, as a fellow American, they expected to be happy that he'd been done away with. There was something quite chilling about that, and it stuck with me, but I think it's only in much later years that I fully realized the significance.
Adam Howe Kochschild, I want to thank you very much for being with us, author of several books, including King Leopold's Ghost, A Story of Greed. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Sharif Abdel-Kadur, Sarah Mate, Steve Martinez, Nicole Salazar, Hani Massoud, Robbie Karen, Mike DeFilippo, and Miguel Noguera are engineers. Special thanks also to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Jessica Lee, Nick Gilla, Hugh Grand, Jessel Noor, Vesta Godars, John Randolph, Kieran Krug Meadows, Raquel Penny, Kellen Innocent. We'll be broadcasting from Park City, Utah throughout the week next week at the Sundance Film Festival. Send us story ideas at stories@democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.